In 2008, the biggest banks in the world collapsed under their own leverage. The federal government stepped in and handed them hundreds of billions of dollars, not loans, transfers. The executives kept their bonuses. Not a single major bank CEO went to prison. In 2003, two of the most powerful governments in the Western world stood in front of television cameras and told their populations there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Millions of people marched in protest. The governments proceeded anyway. The weapons were not there. The cost exceeded $2 trillion and 100,000 civilian lives, depending on the estimate you choose to believe. The people who made the decision faced no meaningful consequences whatsoever. In 2020, official health guidance changed 3 times in 6 months. Not because the science changed, because the communication strategy changed. Institutions that had built century-long reputations on technical authority said one thing in February, something different in April, something else in August, and then expressed visible irritation when people started asking follow-up questions. In 2022, the largest central banks on Earth called the inflation they had manufactured with their own money printing transitory. Inflation peaked at levels not seen since the early 1980s. It was not transitory. The word was quietly retired from official vocabulary without acknowledgement or apology. Every single one of those events happened within the conscious, politically aware lifetime of someone who is 22 years old right now. And here's what's interesting. It's not that Gen Z is especially angry about this. Most of them aren't even that angry. They just don't believe you anymore. About anything. Automatically, the default position isn't outrage. It's a kind of calm, permanent skepticism that operates before any specific piece of information even arrives. So here's the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. At what point does trust the institution stop being wisdom and start being a character flaw? We're going to explain how institutional trust actually works as a mechanism, why that mechanism is breaking specifically and irreversibly for this generation, and why that breakdown has financial consequences that go far beyond politics, culture, or whatever your uncle argues about at family gatherings. Because here's the thing most conversations about this topic completely miss. Trust isn't just a feeling. Trust is infrastructure. It's how economies allocate capital, how employers extract productivity, how governments maintain compliance without deploying constant force. When the infrastructure degrades, money moves. It always moves. And understanding where it moves and why is the whole game. The framework I'm using through this entire video is simple, and I want you to keep it in mind the whole time. Institutions are contracts. That's the model. You give an institution your compliance, your time, your money, your credential-seeking behavior, your deference, and in return, the institution gives you something back. Security, status, a credential that signals your value in the labor market. A retirement check, a shared and reasonably coherent account of how the world works, an identity that connects you to something larger than yourself. Contracts work because both parties believe the other will hold up their end. The moment one side starts consistently defaulting, and the other side has enough information to notice, the contract is functionally over. What you have after that is two parties performing the ritual of the contract with increasing awkwardness while both understand privately that the underlying agreement has collapsed. That is precisely where we are in 2026. And I want to show you exactly how we got here. The contract, the institutional contract that governed most of the 20th century in the developed world, was actually pretty functional for a remarkably long time. Let me be clear about that, because the point isn't that institutions were always broken. The point is that they worked, then they stopped working, and the generation currently entering economic adulthood is the first one that has never known them to work. From roughly the end of World War II through the late 1990s, there was a genuine social architecture, particularly in the United States, that rewarded institutional compliance with measurable consistency. You graduated high school, you either went to college or entered a skilled trade. You worked for a company for decades. The company gave you a pension, an actual defined benefit pension, not a 401k where you bear all the investment risk. You retired with enough to live on. The government maintained the currency well enough that savings were not actively destroyed by inflation over a working life. Your neighborhood was stable enough that the home you bought appreciated in line with general prosperity rather than in bizarre disconnection from wages. And the information you received from major media outlets, for all its obvious distortions and blind spots, was at least constrained by the genuine economic cost of being demonstrably wrong too often. That's the contract. I'm not romanticizing it. It had brutal exclusions. It was built on structures that locked out enormous portions of the population by race, by gender, by class. But for the people it worked for, it genuinely worked. Compliance with the institutional structure paid off in predictable, compounding ways. Now, here's the critical thing to understand about why this matters financially. A contract that works generates enormous efficiencies. When you trust your employer's pension, you don't need to become a sophisticated investor. When you trust your bank, you don't need to understand alternative stores of value. When you trust your university's credential, you don't need to build a parallel track record to demonstrate your competence. Trust is a massive simplification device. It lets you outsource complexity to institutions and focus your energy on a narrower set of decisions. When trust breaks down, all that complexity lands back on the individual. Everything you used to be able to outsource, you now have to understand and manage yourself. That's an enormous cognitive and practical burden, and it falls disproportionately on the generation that enters the economy after the trust is already gone, because they never had the option of the simpler world. That's the first thing I want you to understand. The institutional contracts didn't just fail morally or politically. They failed by eliminating a system that genuinely reduced the cost of participation in the economy for most people. The replacement for that system is more demanding, more complex, and requires more individual competence, which is either an opportunity or a catastrophe depending entirely on what you do with it. The contracts didn't collapse all at once. They collapsed institution by institution, starting in different sectors at different times, like a building where each floor gives way independently before the structure finally becomes obviously unsafe. And the sequence matters, because each institution that failed made the adjacent contracts more fragile. Trust doesn't just transfer from one institution to another, it drains. The financial system broke first in the visible dramatic sense. 2008 is the landmark event, but the groundwork was built over 2 decades of deliberate deregulation. The removal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 allowed commercial banks and investment banks to merge their risk profiles in ways that had been specifically prohibited since the Great Depression. Specifically because regulators in the 1930s had watched unconstrained financial leverage destroy the economy, and concluded that some limits were worth enforcing. The lesson was unlearned within a generation. By 2007, major financial institutions were operating with leverage ratios of 25 or 30 to 1, meaning for every $1 of actual capital, they had borrowed $25 or $30 to invest in assets whose value depended entirely on the assumption that American housing prices would never collectively and simultaneously decline. That's a circular assumption. Housing prices have been rising partly because easy money was being lent to anyone who could sign a document. The money was easy because the securities built on those loans were being sold as safe. The securities were being sold as safe because the prices were rising. When housing prices stopped rising, the entire chain unwound in about 18 months. What the institutional contract said at that moment was clear. Institutions that take excessive risk, make catastrophic bets, and endanger the broader system face consequences. Losses are the feedback mechanism. Without losses, there is no signal. Without signal, there is no correction. Markets without consequences aren't markets. They're casinos with a bailout desk at the back. What actually happened was that the federal government injected $700 billion through the initial TARP program alone, and the Federal Reserve's total support through emergency lending facilities, asset purchase programs, and interest rate manipulation brought total extraordinary support to financial institutions well above $4 trillion across the subsequent years. The institutions were recapitalized, the executives retained their positions, many retained their performance bonuses. The regulatory response was Dodd-Frank, which added compliance costs and bureaucracy without fundamentally altering the incentive structure that had produced the crisis. The homeowners whose mortgages had been packaged, sliced, rated falsely, and sold as safe securities to pension funds and foreign sovereign wealth vehicles around the world, many of them lost their houses. The people at the center of the fraud were protected by the structure of the bailout. The people at the edge of the system absorbed the losses. This is the contract violation stated plainly. The institutions that created the catastrophe were protected from its consequences. The individuals who trusted those institutions were not. A 22-year-old in 2026 was born in 2003 or 2004. They were 4 or 5 years old during the crisis itself. But they grew up in the psychological and economic aftermath. They grew up in households where 2008 was referenced the way previous generations referenced the Depression, where it became a fixed point of reference in how adults talked about banks, about government, about the economy. Before this generation could vote, before they opened their first bank account, they had absorbed a detailed cultural account of how the financial system's most powerful actors had failed spectacularly, been rescued completely, and faced no meaningful accountability. You don't teach a child that lesson deliberately. They just hear it repeatedly and update accordingly. Then the universities broke the contract. The university contract was specific. You pay for a credential. The credential signals your value in the labor market. Employers use the signal to hire you at a premium over non-credentialed candidates. The premium is large enough and reliable enough to justify the cost and time of acquiring the credential. Over a career, the net present value is clearly positive. For a long time, the math worked. In the 1980s, the average annual tuition at a four-year public university in the United States was around $3,000 in nominal terms. Adjusted to today's purchasing power, that's roughly $9,000 per year. Add room and board and you're looking at perhaps $15,000 annually. You could work summers and part-time during the school year and graduate with manageable debt or no debt at all. By 2024, the average total cost of attendance at a four-year public university was over $30,000 per year. Not a private school. Not an Ivy League institution. A state school, funded partly by public taxation, was charging $30,000 per year for a domestic student. Over 4 years, that's over $120,000 for the credential. Private institutions were frequently double that. The mechanism that produced this is not complicated. Federal student loan programs were designed to make higher education accessible by removing credit constraints from prospective students. The intention was reasonable. The effect was that universities suddenly faced demand that was effectively price insensitive, backed by government-guaranteed loans that could not be discharged in bankruptcy. When demand becomes price insensitive, prices rise. Every year, universities raised tuition, and every year applications continued because the cultural consensus still held that the credential was worth whatever it cost. The universities used the revenue to build facilities, hire administrators in rapidly expanding non-academic departments, and compete for rankings metrics that rewarded spending. Then they raised prices again. Total student debt outstanding in the United States is currently over $1.9 trillion. The average borrower carries something around $37,000. But that average conceals the distribution. Four-year private university graduates frequently carry $60,000, $80,000, or $100,000 in debt. Graduate and professional school borrowers sometimes carry $200,000 or more. And the credential has simultaneously inflated in supply while deflating in distinctiveness. In 1970, roughly 11% of American adults held a four-year college degree. Today, it's over 35%. When more than a third of the working-age population holds the same credential, the credential stops functioning as a differentiator. It becomes a baseline. You don't get ahead by having it. You just don't get immediately filtered out by not having it. The contract now reads as follows. You borrow $100,000. You spend the next 8 to 12 years making debt payments that constrain every major financial decision in your 20s and early 30s. You receive in exchange the right to not be automatically rejected for entry-level positions that may or may not exist in your field by the time you graduate. That's the transaction. The brochure implied something different. Gen Z figured this out. Not all of them, and not all at once, but as a statistical pattern in enrollment data, in polling about the value of higher education, in the explosion of alternative training pathways. A generation that watched the slightly older cohort graduate into the 2008 recession with $50,000 in debt and credentials that the damaged labor market couldn't absorb, has been recalculating the contract math for 15 years. But here's what matters for the financial argument. Distrusting the university didn't stop there. It contaminated adjacent institutions. When you stop believing the credential signals what it used to signal, you start doubting the employers who required it. When you doubt the employers, you doubt the career paths they represent. When you doubt the career paths, you doubt the financial planning advice built around those paths. The 401k, the 30-year mortgage at 28, the diversified index fund portfolio held for 40 years until retirement. Not because that advice is wrong in isolation, but because it arrived from the same institutional ecosystem that delivered the other advice. The advice about the credential that paid for itself. The advice about the banks that were too big to fail but also too important to regulate, and that advice was wrong. So the credibility of everything touching it gets discounted. That's the second order effect. Contract failures are not contained. They radiate. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. I put these frameworks out regularly, and the goal is always to give you a way to read what's happening in financial and institutional systems before the implications become obvious. It's free. It's probably worth your time. Let me give you a concrete scenario so the numbers have somewhere to land. Two brothers, same family, same city, same upbringing. 2 years apart in age. The older brother does exactly what the institutional contract prescribes. He's 26 in 2014. He graduates from a mid-tier state university with a business administration degree and $48,000 in federal student loan debt. He gets an entry-level position at a regional financial services firm paying $42,000 per year. He contributes 6% of his salary to his 401k to capture the full employer match. He lives in an apartment, manages his loan payments, and follows the path the institution's designed. By 2024, he is 36. He's been promoted twice. His salary is $81,000 per year. His 401k has around $95,000 in it, assuming market returns consistent with the period. His student loans are fully paid off, which took most of his 30s to accomplish. He bought a 2-bedroom condo in 2019 for $240,000, which is worth roughly $310,000 on paper in the current market. His net worth is approximately $165,000. Functional, stable, slow. The younger brother is 24 in 2014. He spent 2 years watching his older brother's trajectory and decided to skip the university path entirely. He completed a 1-year technical training program in software development for $12,000, which he paid for in cash by working 2 part-time jobs during the year prior. He started a junior developer role at $29,000 in 2014. He switched employers twice in 4 years, which is how you actually get significant salary increases in technical fields rather than waiting for annual performance reviews. By 2018, he was earning $74,000 annually. He began contributing to low-cost index funds immediately on his first paycheck. No 401k match because his first employer didn't offer one, so he opened a Roth IRA and contributed the maximum every year starting in 2014. He purchased a single-family rental property in a secondary Midwestern market in 2018, putting $30,000 down on a $140,000 house. By 2020, the rent reliably covered the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, and generated approximately $400 per month in positive cash flow. In 2021, during the period of forced remote work and digital service demand expansion, he launched a small independent software consulting operation that by 2024 generates around $60,000 per year in revenue. By 2024, he is 34. His index fund and Roth IRA portfolio is approximately $230,000. The rental property is worth roughly $190,000 in the current market, with around $80,000 in equity. His consulting operation, valued conservatively at 2 times annual revenue, represents another $120,000 of asset value. Total net worth approximately $430,000 at 34 years old. Same family, same city, same cognitive ability, because that's not the variable here. Different contracts, I want to be clear about that. It delivered stability, predictability, incremental advancement, a real asset. A retirement account didn't collapse for him, it just returned less. The younger brother's path carried real risk. The rental could have been a problem property. The boot camp could have led to a dead-end job market. The consulting business could have failed to generate consistent revenue. None of those risks materialized, but they were real. What the numbers show is that the institutional path didn't fail. It just failed to compete given the alternatives available to someone willing to operate outside the standard structure. And when compliance stops being the highest returning available option, when the expected value of the alternative clearly exceeds the expected value of the institutional path, rational people start moving. The question is whether their institutions notice and whether they care. Now let me get into the territory that most people skip over because it makes everyone uncomfortable. The media contract breaking is what tied everything together. The original media contract, the one that functioned from roughly the mid-20th century through the 2000s, was essentially this. You give us your attention. We give you a reasonably coherent, reasonably accurate account of significant events. We are constrained from lying systematically by the economic reality that we need your continued attention, and you will eventually stop paying attention if we're consistently wrong. We are also constrained by advertisers who don't want their products associated with discredited outlets. And we're constrained by the reputational cost of being publicly, demonstrably wrong on major events. Those constraints were never absolute. Media had always been shaped by ownership interests, political pressure, cultural blind spots. But the constraints were real enough to produce a floor of accuracy. You could read the major newspapers and watch the major networks and have a reasonably functional understanding of what was happening in the world, with obvious caveats about framing and omission. The internet didn't just disrupt media economically, it destroyed the specific constraint structure that had produced the floor of accuracy. When anyone can publish, when distribution costs nothing, when algorithms reward emotional activation over informational accuracy, the economics that had kept major outlets at least partially accountable to truth simply ceased to apply. The new economics rewarded something completely different. What replaced the old structure is what we navigate now. An information environment in which every outlet is competing to produce the most emotionally engaged version of its specific audience segment, not the most informed version of that audience. The most activated, the most outraged, the most anxious, the most tribal. Because activation produces engagement, engagement produces traffic, and traffic is the only metric that matters when distribution is free and attention is scarce. The result is a media landscape where being wrong on major predictions costs almost nothing as long as you remain emotionally resonant with your audience. You can describe a financial crisis as imminent for 7 consecutive years, or deny one for 3 years before it arrives, and face essentially no professional consequence as long as your tribe keeps clicking. Gen Z didn't learn this through media criticism theory. They learned it empirically, in adolescence, during the period of maximum information consumption, watching 5 separate outlets describe the same event in 5 mutually exclusive ways and then attack each other on the same platforms they'd used to spread their incompatible accounts. They grew up in an information environment that was visibly, demonstrably, almost comically broken. They didn't become skeptical of media because someone educated them about institutional capture. They became skeptical because the media kept demonstrating its own unreliability faster than any educational program could keep up with. Here's the financial implication that people consistently underrate. Media is the primary channel through which institutions communicate legitimacy. It's how the Federal Reserve explains the rationale for its decisions. It's how the FDA communicates its recommendations. It's how companies explain their quarterly results to investors. It's how central banks signal their intentions to currency markets. If the channel is broken, if nobody trusts the information passing through it, then all of those communications carry a credibility discount they didn't used to carry. When no single information source commands wide trust, decision-making methodology changes. People shift towards signals that are harder to fake and incentive structures that are easier to verify. Price action instead of press releases. What institutions actually do with money instead of what their spokespeople claim to believe. Revealed preferences over stated positions. Skin in the game is a filter for whose analysis to take seriously. That's actually a fairly rigorous epistemology. It also happens to be exhausting to operate at scale, and it creates a specific vulnerability that I want to name directly. When trust in large institutions collapses, people don't stop trusting. They redirect trust to smaller, more proximate sources, smaller communities, individual creators, podcast hosts, online personalities with follower counts in the single-digit millions rather than the tens of millions. Discord servers and private forums, peer groups who share the same skepticism of official sources. Here's the uncomfortable part. Smaller authorities have their own incentive structures, their own ways of exploiting the trust that flows to them when institutional trust drains away. The creator economy, which is the primary alternative information ecosystem that Gen Z actually inhabits, has the same fundamental incentive problem as legacy media. It rewards engagement over accuracy, emotional resonance over informational quality, tribal belonging over intellectual honesty. It just has a different aesthetic and a more fragmented distribution. A generation appropriately skeptical of the Wall Street Journal editorial board is not automatically equipped to be skeptical of the personal finance influencer with 2.4 million followers explaining which emerging market. Cryptocurrency represents generational opportunity. Distrust of established institutions is not identical to good judgment. They can coexist with almost no overlap. That's the trap that the distrust narrative sets. The trap is that reflexive skepticism of large institutions can coexist with remarkable credulity towards small ones, because the small ones have successfully performed the aesthetic of rebellion, the aesthetic of not being mainstream, the aesthetic of telling you what the establishment doesn't want you to know. The establishment frequently does want you not to know things, but the person performing that aesthetic for monetized attention is not automatically the one who actually knows those things. Now, here's the part most people doing this conversation get completely backwards, and I want to be precise about it because the direction of causality matters enormously for what you should actually do. You think the problem is that Gen Z doesn't trust institutions, but actually the problem is that institutions stopped being trustworthy and continued demanding trust anyway. These are completely different diagnoses with completely different implications. If the issue is unwarranted distrust, the solution is better communication, more transparency, better PR, rebuild the narrative bridge between institution and public. The institution stays at the center of the solution. If the issue is institutions that have genuinely failed their contracts continuing to extract compliance through cultural inertia and the absence of visible alternatives, then distrust is the accurate response. And the solution is to build functional alternatives rather than manage the optics of institutions that have already defaulted. The institutional defenders consistently argue for the first framing because it keeps the institution at the center of the conversation and the solution. The institutional critics consistently argue for the second framing, but frequently lack a coherent practical alternative that scales. Most individuals are trapped between two rhetorical positions, neither of which is actually helping them build wealth in an environment where the old contract no longer reliably delivers. Let me give you 3 levels of what's actually happening. Level 1 is what fills every mainstream cultural conversation. Gen Z doesn't trust institutions. This is accurate but shallow. It describes a phenomenon without explaining it and without telling you what to do with the information. Level 2 is the layer immediately beneath that. The institutions Gen Z distrusts actually did fail their contracts, specifically, demonstrably across multiple sectors over a compressed period of time. This is less comfortable to say in public discourse, because those institutions still control significant capital, significant cultural authority, and significant media channels. But it's verifiable if you look at the sequence of events, rather than the institutional communications about those events. Level 3 is where the practical implications live. When institutional trust collapses in an economy, capital flows change. Always, without exception, where capital flows change, opportunity structures change. Where opportunity structures change, the playbook for building wealth changes with them, and the people who recognize the change before it becomes consensus can position around it. The people who recognize it after it becomes consensus are just buying the top of whatever the next institutional substitute becomes. Let me walk through what level 3 actually looks like in practice, because this is the financial argument I want you to take away. When trust in banks specifically degrades, people look for alternative stores of value and alternative mechanisms for transacting. We have watched this play out dramatically. Bitcoin went from a fringe experiment in 2009 to a recognized institutional asset class by 2021, and a fully mainstream macroeconomic hedge asset by 2024. The total market capitalization of the crypto asset class, whatever you personally think of any specific part of it, represents capital that previously sat in instruments tied to institutional trust, and has been redirected to instruments explicitly designed to not require it. That's trillions of dollars of capital allocation driven substantially by distrust. Gold demand rises predictably during periods of elevated institutional distrust. Real assets broadly, things you can hold directly without a financial intermediary standing between you and the asset, get repriced upward relative to financial assets whose value depends on institutional promises being honored. This isn't ideological, it's basic portfolio theory applied to an environment where the risk profile of the promise-honoring institutions has changed. When trust in employers specifically degrades, the psychological employment contract changes. Loyalty that used to flow implicitly from employees to employers in exchange for long-term stability gets withdrawn. The transaction becomes explicitly short-term and bilateral. This is frequently described as a cultural failing of younger workers. But if you look at the actual data on employer behavior over the same period, on restructuring rates, on real wage growth relative to executive compensation, on the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution retirement structures that transferred investment risk from employers to employees, the withdrawal of employee loyalty is just the lagging correct response to the prior withdrawal of employer loyalty. The practical implication of explicit transactionalism in employment is that the smart employee treats their current employer as one component of a diversified income strategy rather than as the provider of their entire financial future. Parallel income streams, equity stakes outside the employer relationship, skills that travel across employers rather than skills that are specific to one institutional context. The diversified approach carries more cognitive overhead. It rewards people who can operate with more complexity. That's the new structure. It replaced the old one when the old one stopped performing. When trust in the credential system specifically degrades, market mechanisms for signaling competence outside the credentialing system get increasingly priced. Portfolios, demonstrated track records on public platforms, revenue from actual products or services, verified results rather than certified potential. These don't fully replace institutional credentials, particularly in sectors where licensing requirements are legally enforced. But they create a parallel signaling track that allows demonstrated competence to outrun certified competence in fields where institutional credentialing hasn't kept pace with the actual knowledge required. And when trust in the currency and the central institutions managing it degrades, you see the most fundamental portfolio shift. Increased demand for real estate, for ownership stakes in actual businesses that generate real cash flow, for commodities, for assets with structurally limited supply. The inflation of the last 4 years has accelerated this shift substantially. A 22-year-old who watched their savings earn essentially nothing in a bank account, while their cost of living rose meaningfully, has a direct personal experience of what inflation does to cash savings. They don't need a macroeconomics course to tell them that holding $100,000 in a savings account earning 1.2% annually while inflation runs at 4 to 6% means losing $3,000 to $5,000 of purchasing power per year while the nominal balance looks fine. All of these shifts are happening simultaneously, and they're happening fastest in the cohort with the lowest institutional trust. Which means Gen Z, as a wealth-building cohort, is disproportionately moving toward the asset classes and income structures that institutional distrust has historically directed capital toward. Gen Z has trust issues. Millennials have trust issues too, but they're still making payments on the student loans for the degree they needed to get the job that required the degree from the university, that told them the degree would pay for itself before 2008 rewrote that particular calculation. At least one of these generations is internally consistent. And while all of this has been happening in the financial dimension, the government response to it has largely been to communicate more earnestly. Hire more communications professionals and express confusion about why institutional messaging isn't landing with the target demographic. Someone in a boardroom in 2012 said they should probably understand why young people don't trust them. Someone else said they'd just wait for them to need a mortgage. The rates ended up at 7%. The boardroom did not update its priors. Let me come back to where I started. 2008, 2003, 2020. 2022, banks bailed out. Wars built on false evidence. Guidance that changed with the wind. Inflation called temporary while it kept rising. A 22-year-old in 2026 has lived through all of it in their conscious formation, not abstractly, in their awareness, in their family conversations, in the cultural vocabulary that shaped how they understand authority, competence, and accountability. Is that distrust a bug or a feature? Here's my actual answer. It's neither. Distrust calibrated to an accurate reading of the institutional track record is not a psychological flaw and not a cultural achievement. It's just correct pattern recognition. The institutions failed their contracts in demonstrable and documented ways. A generation with access to the documentation updated accordingly. That's rational. The bug isn't the distrust, the bug is what a lot of people do with it. When the contract breaks, you have 3 options and most people choose the wrong one. Option 1 is to keep honoring your end of the contract while the institution stops honoring theirs. This is what most people do by default. They stay in the credential system, they stay in the employment loyalty model, they keep their money in instruments tied to institutional promises, because the alternatives seem uncertain and the old path at least has a recognizable shape. This works out to slow financial decay with extra steps. Not catastrophic, just consistently lower returns than the available alternatives, compounding over decades into a significant gap. Option 2 is to burn it down ideologically, to make institutional distrust an identity, to position every alternative as automatically better than everything institutional, and to perform skepticism as a tribal signal. This is what a large portion of the online distrust discourse actually is. It feels analytically rigorous. It frequently isn't. It produces strong social group coherence and weak individual financial outcomes, because the energy goes into performing the skepticism rather than building the alternative. Option 3 is the one that actually moves money. Quietly identify which parts of the old structure still function, build alternatives for the parts that don't, and make every decision based on current incentive structures rather than historical ones. No ideology about it, no identity construction around it. Just clear-eyed assessment of what still works and what has stopped working, followed by capital allocation that reflects that assessment. That's the playbook. And here are 3 specific, non-generic things that follow directly from it. First, stop treating credentials as assets and start treating them as entrance tickets. An asset builds compound value over time. A credential doesn't compound. It gets you in the door for a first look, and then your track record takes over. The credential stops mattering almost immediately after it achieves its purpose. This means spending the minimum necessary to acquire the ticket for whatever door you're trying to open, and spending the maximum possible building a track record that exists independently of any institution. Demonstrated competence is the actual asset. The credential is the mechanism to get a single opportunity to demonstrate it. Confusing the two is how people end up with $100,000 of debt and a piece of paper that expires the moment the labor market shifts. Second, separate your income source from your wealth-building vehicle. The institutional employment model packaged these together because the pension was the wealth-building vehicle. That model is functionally dead for most sectors outside government employment. Your current employer is an income source. Your wealth accumulation happens in assets you own, assets whose value doesn't depend on the continued existence and goodwill of your employer, and assets that compound on your behalf without requiring your active attention every day. A 401k match is still worth capturing because it's an immediate 100% return on that specific dollar. But do not confuse employment security with financial security. One is a function of your relationship with an organization that can restructure at any time for any reason. The other is a function of the assets you own outright. Treat them as completely separate problems with completely separate solutions. Third, when institutional trust collapses, the replacement signal for who and what to believe is track record plus incentive alignment. Before you take financial advice, medical advice, investment advice, or any significant advice from any source, ask 2 questions in this order. What is the verifiable track record of this person or institution on the specific type of claim they're making? And what actually happens to them if they're wrong? If the track record is strong and the downside of being wrong is real and hits them personally, the advice is worth considering. If the track record is unclear and the downside of being wrong falls entirely on you while they collect fees or views or subscribers regardless of outcome, discount accordingly. These 2 questions filter out approximately 80% of the noise in any information environment, whether you trust the institution delivering the information or not. Because here's the thing, Gen Z being the last generation to trust institutions isn't actually a story about Gen Z. It's a story about institutions. They ran a functional contract into the ground through consistent short-term extraction at the expense of long-term credibility. The generation that witnessed the full sequence of failures just happened to be young enough and connected enough and equipped enough to start building something different before the old structure fully collapses. The question isn't whether the distrust is justified. It is. The question is what you build with it. If you want to keep getting these frameworks before they become obvious, subscribe, 1 video at a time.